This is the Road to War Objective 3 about the challenges faced by CSA President Jeff Davis and U.S. President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Now, let's start with Jeff Davis here, and things you have to understand about Davis. He's a man of integrity who was sincerely devoted to the Southern cause. But he was also very tense, very serious, and very stubborn. And he really wasn't overly well liked by anyone. Hopefully his wife did, but I'm not exactly sure, judging by the picture. Now, Davis often defied public opinion in the South, and frankly defied the Confederate Congress. In a lot of cases, some people talked of impeachment. But what was it that he did that upset people so much? Well, the biggest thing oftentimes had to do with the Confederate Constitution. The Confederate Constitution promoted states' rights, not the idea of a strong central government. You can see on the slide here, it says, "We the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character in order to form a permanent federal government, establish justice, etc., etc." I mean, it was a federal government in a sense. It had a national level of government with Jeff Davis in the Capitol. But again, remember what they were fighting for in the first place. It was to have their own rights and freedoms and not be so dictated by a strong central government. Now, that really rubbed some people the wrong way because Davis took a series of actions that, frankly, aren't too bad in terms of running a country. But they really kind of flew in the face of why the Confederates had rebelled against the United States in the first place. Davis was fought by states on various decisions he tried to make during the war. Some Confederate troops, for example, refused to fight outside of their own state. And Davis instituted a policy saying, listen, if we draft you for the war, or if you, I should say, volunteer for the war, you're going to fight for the Confederacy wherever we need you to fight. You're not going to just fight in the state that you're from. A lot of states didn't like Davis and the quote-unquote Confederate federal government or the Confederate national government stepping in and saying that, you know, we could pluck you out of Georgia and make you go fight in Mississippi if that's where we needed you. A national army can do that. State armies should not have to do that. That was the view of the Confederate people. And also, Jeff Davis got himself in a little bit of trouble when he instituted a draft in 1862. This was another thing that the Confederate people didn't ever want to see, was a draft instituted. But it didn't make much of a difference. Rich men could hire replacements or just buy their way out of it if they wanted to. That led to poor Southerners growing resentful of the rich because, you know, they could just pay someone to take their place in the war. Now, Lincoln, meanwhile, had a more stable situation in an established government, but that doesn't mean he didn't face some of his own challenges. Lincoln's challenges usually involved him doing some constitutionally questionable things on the basis of him believing that they needed to be done. A lot of times, Abe Lincoln was described as King Lincoln because he felt he had to be kind of a king. But he never believed that he would have to do that after the Union was restored. It's just that in a martial law, military law type of situation, he just felt like sometimes there were decisions that had to be made and you didn't always have the time to wait for the proper channels to get it done. One of the things that benefited Lincoln when he first took office, or I should say when the war first started, was that Congress was not in session. And while they were still in their home states, Lincoln does a series of things without congressional approval. He issued a naval blockade of the South and increased the numbers in the Army. He gave $2 million to a military supplier. He took measures to ensure that anti-Unionists would be arrested, and he, quote-unquote, supervised voting in the border states. All of these things tended to bend the rules of constitutionality a little bit, particularly when it came to the Bill of Rights. Lincoln also eventually institutes the first nationwide draft law in U.S. history in 1863. Notice that I said U.S. history because the Confederates had done it in 1862, but they weren't part of the United States, so that history doesn't count. In 1863, he institutes the first nationwide draft law, and it basically said if drafted that, yeah, like the South had done, you could pay $300 to get out of it, or hire a substitute to take your place and go be in the Army and fight in the war. Because of this, draftees who were very poor financially grew to hate the quote-unquote $300 men, the guys who got drafted and were able to buy their way out of the war. As a result of the draft law of 1863, there was a riot in New York City, started by the Irish, who were both very poor, and therefore hated the rich who were getting out of this thing, and also very anti-African American. They didn't see the need to be forced into a war to save slaves. In their eyes, they thought that's the only reason it was being fought. So many died during the New York riots, and some African Americans were lynched in the process. Again, this is in New York City, a northern state. Both sides faced a series of economic challenges. In the North, during the Civil War, the Morrill Tariff Act proved to be a pretty significant challenge. You can see here it says it doubled the pre-war tariff and protected the economy. Remember, the idea behind a tariff is that you raise the rates for foreign countries to be able to sell their products here. The higher you raise the rates, the more difficult you make for a foreign nation to sell its products here, because in order to pay those rates, they have to raise their production costs. And if they raise their production costs, then they've got to make the price twice as much as that just to make it worth it to even sell the product in the first place. If you keep your tariffs low, then they can afford to keep their overall selling prices low. But if you raise tariffs high, then they have to raise their selling prices very high as well. Well, the Morrill Tariff Act increased tariffs by 5 to 10%. Tariffs just kept going up during the war and became associated with Lincoln's Republican Party. They become known as the ones that are about the high tariff rates to protect American businesses. Because again, remember, think law of demand here. People who buy stuff are going to buy the less expensive item. And if American suppliers can sell it for a lower price, then it protects them from foreign competition. You raise the tariff rates, you make it more difficult for foreigners to sell here because they have to raise their production costs to pay for the tariff, and therefore have to raise their overall prices. Americans aren't likely to buy from them. They'll more likely instead buy from Americans who have lower prices. Make sense, everybody? If not, ask me about it a little later in class. Meanwhile, another economic struggle that the North faced was when they issued greenbacks, or paper money, but it wasn't backed up by enough gold. Remember, a currency is only as good as what's backing it, and if you print too much currency, then each of it's like a surplus of currency. The value of each one of them is basically worthless. Without enough gold to back it up, greenbacks really didn't do a whole lot in terms of buying things with any value, and therefore it took a lot of them to buy stuff. In other words, inflation. Too many greenbacks, not enough gold to back it up. The government, in turn, also had to borrow $2.6 billion. That would be $36 billion today in U.S. Treasury bonds, basically selling them to the American people. With a Treasury bond, you're basically loaning money to the government, and they'll pay you back eventually with interest. Well, the government borrowed $2.6 billion to help out the economy. And also another challenge was the formation, or a part of these challenges, was the formation of the national banking system in 1863. This is something that should probably be on your timeline. The idea was that it would sell government bonds and provide some kind of stable currency. Now, this is not the national banking system. This is what the national banking system eventually became, which in 1913 became known as the Fed, or the Federal Reserve. The South, meanwhile, had their own economic challenges during the war. They had absolutely no tariffs at all, so they had no way to protect what little industry and production they had down there. Remember, the South never liked tariffs to begin with, because if they raised their tariffs, then foreign nations would make it very difficult for the U.S. to sell over there. And the South really couldn't afford that. So they couldn't afford to generate any revenue through tariffs, or else other countries would get upset with them. They had absolutely no gold to back up Confederate money, and they had very limited tax revenue. Remember, people in the South did not want an oppressive government, and therefore weren't willing to pay a lot in taxes. So to deal with this, they began printing their own currency, the South did, called bluebacks, but with no gold to back it up. It was just worthless paper. Inflation, and yes, you're hearing me right, inflation went up 9,000% as more and more paper money just got printed with nothing or very little to back it up. 9,000% inflation, or raised prices. So basically, it was a mess down there. And while the northern industrial economy boomed during the Civil War and continued to boom from pre-war days, the southern cotton economy was starting to decline as more and more resources were being given to the war effort itself. Okay, that's a basic nutshell of the challenges that both presidents faced. Thanks for listening.